My Govan, and welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about one of the more amusing aspects of Tolkien's whole translation conceit, because it involves an aspect of the story which is already in a way a bit humorous, although not in a comical type of humorous way. It's just more of a, if you think about the implications, it does seem a little funny. And it's all about Pippin being called the Prince of Halflings, or Ernil I Feriannath, while he is in Minas Tirith. And in the book, it doesn't really give us an explicit reason why this happens exactly. And I thought there was something in the appendices about this, but I looked in the appendices and it's not there. But I swear I read this somewhere. Maybe it's in one of his letters, maybe it's somewhere else. But if anybody can point me to where this is and remind me, I'd appreciate it, because I know I have read this somewhere. But the idea here is he is called that because of the way he speaks, which is a much more informal way of speaking than the way of Minas Tirith would, and therefore it gives the impression that he is a superior speaking to inferiors, or at least people who are at best his peers, say like Denethor. And this comes about because of a phenomenon which I have talked about in another video, where I was talking about the use of thou in The Lord of the Rings, because you will see that in a couple of places. Denethor, I believe, uses it with Gandalf when he finally kind of just loses any sense of propriety with Gandalf. And also the mouth of Sauron will use it at the Black Gate. I think of both Aragorn and Gandalf. And one of the things that modern English speakers don't tend to realize is that thou is not an archaic formal way of speaking. It's actually an archaic informal way of speaking. So if you've studied, say, French, Spanish, or one of these other languages where there are two forms of you, one for the formal address and one for informal address, you're already familiar with this concept, but most people don't understand how it works in English. In English, you is formal, thou is informal. And in modern English, unlike in some of these other languages where they've kind of dropped out the formal, we've just maintained the formal and dropped the informal. And so to our ears, the informal word now sounds a lot more archaic and formal, because we only see it in old documents that we kind of imagine as being more formal. But that's not really what's going on. When, say, the mouth of Sauron uses thou with Aragorn and Gandalf, he's doing it out of contempt, right? That's just not, he's not doing that because he thinks of them as familiars or friends. And when Denethor does it with Gandalf, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, I no longer have any respect for you. I am not going to use a formal pronoun uh, to address you anymore. That's where that's coming from. But where does this come in with Pippin? Because we never see Pippin use the word thou. Well, this is why this translation conceit is so wild. And it just proves how far Tolkien was willing to go in maintaining this whole idea, because it's absolutely beautiful in its humor the way this works. So in the words that we get from Pippin, we never see him using this informal thou, right? It never happens. We don't see really, I don't think anybody at all use that informal until we get to stuff like Denethor and the Mouth of Sauron. There may be a couple where you actually have people addressing actual friends or inferiors. And by inferiors, I don't mean, inferior in like an inherent way, but like somebody who is lesser in rank or something like that, right? There might be a use of it with Galadriel talking to Gimli in one of her messages. I don't remember. But most of the uses we get are the Blackgate and Denethor talking to Gandalf, and there might be a scattered handful of uses elsewhere. But other than that, we never see this, and we certainly don't see the hobbits using this. But why is that if that's their kind of normal mode of speech? This goes back to the translation conceit, and the reason why Tolkien would not use thou in translating theirs is because for them, whatever that word was for the informal second person address, it's all one and the same with the formal. I mean, they use it for both, So, I mean, whereas Bilbo Baggins might address Hamfast Gamgee with an informal, Hamfast Gamgee would also refer to Bilbo in the informal. Because even though one is a boss of the other, they all just use the same word. Just like in modern English, we all use the formal, we don't actually think of it as formal, you, as opposed to thou. I'm not using it in a formal way when I talk to, say, my kids and I say, you need to do this. No, I'm using it as an informal, but we just use the same word both ways. So if Pippin and the other hobbits are all using the informal both ways, then what's really going on here is Tolkien is translating that informal in a way which is consonant with Pippin's intended meaning, not necessarily the strict word-to-word type of translation you might get if you were being, in some sense, an uncareful translator. So in other words, Tolkien is, in his translation conceit, recognizing that Pippin and the other hobbits all use the same word for you in all circumstances, and therefore you cannot attribute to Pippin an intent to treat Denethor as a familiar or an inferior just because he's using an informal you. And so therefore, in translating Pippin's words, we don't want to translate just the words themselves, but the kind of meaning behind them that we have to ascribe to Pippin. Pippin is appropriately reverent and subservient to Denethor, especially once he swears fealty and service to him, in payment for what Boromir did for him. And so we can't think of Pippin as just being this, like, I don't really think you're anything, I'm just going to refer to you in the informal. No, that's not what's going on. I mean, that's clearly not what Pippin is thinking. Therefore, when he uses an informal word, what Tolkien is doing as the translator is giving us what Pippin means as opposed to what he's literally saying. And this is a job that translators have to do often, right? Every language has its idiomatic, ways of talking that don't really make sense if you translate literally to another language. And I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but if you studied other languages sufficiently to learn idiomatic expressions, you will realize very quickly that you can't translate that phrase or whatever literally into a different language because it no longer carries the same idea, which is why translators will often not literally translate the words, but translate it to something that in the other language it's being translated into, give it a phrase in that language that will mean the same thing to a reader or hearer of that phrase. So, if we're using an idiomatic phrase for, I'm trying to think of a good example in English, but I'm, doing it on the fly is kind of hard. But, there's all kinds of expressions that if you think about when we say them, we don't necessarily mean the words literally. We're talking about something else, and it's just a way of talking that we've inherited from who knows how long ago. And so that phrase is not going to make any sense to somebody who speaks Spanish if you just translate word for word. And this is why Google Translate can be kind of dangerous, because Google Translate or other services like that, they get better over time, but they mostly translate word for word literally without really taking into account understood meanings within cultures and languages that, you can't just pick up by looking at the words on the page. You have to understand that by being in that culture. Tolkien is doing the same thing with Pippin. He is basically taking what he means rather than what he says and translating that onto the page. And again, this is something that I swear I have read. I just cannot remember where it is. I want to say Tolkien made a comment about how Denethor would have probably found this kind of amusing himself. And of course, for Pippin to do it, it is also kind of amusing as well because Pippin is not only not, like an inherently high ranking person, he is the son of the Thane of the Shire, which in the Shire might mean something, but it doesn't mean that much. And it certainly doesn't mean that much outside of the Shire. But he's still underage. He's not even 33, which is when hobbits come of age, according to, the information we get early on in the book. So for Pippin, who's not even a full adult in some sense, to talk to Denethor, who is the lord and steward of Gondor, and and use the informal is kind of hilarious. Now, Pippin probably does carry himself a bit like he is not necessarily over-important or self-important, but at least he probably carries himself like he's not a peasant, a menial worker, or any of these things, because he is, to the extent that hobbits have class distinctions, he's definitely among the gentry and not, just the common worker or whatever. So he's going to carry himself a little higher, and his use of the informal with Denethor is what then gives everybody this impression that, oh, he's really something because he's talking down to Denethor because, he must be really high ranking wherever he comes from. And so this idea comes that Pippin is the prince of the halflings, because who else would have the gall to talk to the steward of Gondor like that, except somebody who's legitimately like out of a royal house, because that's higher than a steward. So Pippin acquires this moniker, which is ironically not far off, because again, to the extent that there is anything like a single leader of the Shire, the Thane is kind of it. The next closest thing might be the mayor of Mickledelving, but they're really not over all the Shire, although they do kind of preside over some sort of Shire-wide events. And then there's the Master of Buckland, who is kind of a separate thing altogether because they kind of just run, Buckland, which is technically not in the Shire. It's across the river, and so it's just a little bit different. So, and this actually comes up, too, because when the hobbits finally return and find that Lotho, Sackville Baggins, has kind of taken over with the help of Saruman, there's an account given to them of when all this went down, and Pippin's father had apparently basically made the comment after Lotho got elected mayor. He said, if anybody's going to be like the main guy here, it's not going to be some, upstart Sackville Baggins. It's going to be the right Thane of the Shire. So there is still like a leftover element of the Thane being a really important person. And over time, it became an inherited role, inherited by the main line of the Took family, and that is where Pippin is. So ironically, it's not far off to call Pippin a prince of the halflings. It's not correct because it's not a royal house and it has very little actual power. It very often means nothing other than just carrying the title. But it is oddly appropriate in a very loose sort of way. But what I love about this is, again, just how far Tolkien is willing to take this idea, because he uses this little concept that Pippin is called the Prince of Halflings, and he's like, where would that idea come from? Well, he's probably using the informal to talk to Denethor, because that's just the way hobbits have, been using the common speech forever, and therefore they've dropped the formal you, and he doesn't dress him that way, and therefore everybody thinks that he's a superior in some way. It's like, wow. Of all the ways that you could think of to maintain this idea of the translation conceit, this has got to be one of the most tiny little niche type of examples that you could possibly think of. Tolkien comes up with all these different things to explain why, he uses certain things as translations. He uses the common speech as English because that's the main language he's translating into, and then he uses, the language of the Rohirrim as Old English because it kind of has the same relationship to common speech that Old English has to our language, and all this stuff. But then to go down and just be like, I'm going to pull this little Ernil Iferianath reference and be like, aha, here's another way that I can show why I chose certain translation things and make it make sense of this phrase. It's like, man, when Tolkien picks a framing device, he sticks with it so hard. It's just hilarious. So I just wanted to talk about that because I find it so amusing, and because it is such a great example of how Tolkien can both use that translation conceit, but also kind of retcon his own story to fit the way that he does things. It's like, I don't think Tolkien went into this thinking of, the hobbits as speaking an informal version of the language compared to everybody else, and then was like, what would this imply? Oh, let's say that makes Pippin the prince of halflings because everybody's noticing that he speaks the informal to everybody. No, I think he wrote that, and then, if I remember correctly, that's the timeline. He wrote that and then kind of back-ended it into the translation aspect as, okay, so that would imply that maybe the hobbits are all using informal, and that's why everybody thinks he's some real big shot. So it's just, Tolkien is a master at this, and it's so fun to watch him do stuff like this. So if you found this interesting, entertaining, or just otherwise enjoyable, please do like the video, follow along, subscribe, whatever it is on whatever platform you're on, to make sure you catch future content like this. Click the bell icon on YouTube if you're following me there to make sure you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions, and find other support and social links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Paul Leone, Nathan Dufour, and Robert Kindling.